Good morning, all, and welcome to the Scrutiny Panel's Service Improvement and Finance Panel. We have a number. Do we have any apologies, Bridge?
Chair, we have apology from Councillor Matthew Jones. Okay,
thank you. The next item is disclosure of personal and prejudicial interest. This is a budget scrutiny, pre-decision scrutiny. As a result of that, we're covering the whole of the council's budget. And part of that is social services, which I do have a personal interest in because my daughter works for social services. If anybody else has a close family connection with the council, and due to the fact that we are covering the entire budget, I think it would be, appropriate if there are any prejudice, if there's any interest, if they please disclose them. Anyone? Okay. Yes. Okay. So we literally make a note of that. We'll send the forms around. It's only a cautionary note because of the fact that what we are covering today. Okay. Item 3 on the agenda is the prohibition of whip votes and declarations of party whips. This is an item which is always on all scrutiny minutes. Item 4 are the minutes of the previous meeting. The meeting was held on the 17th of January. Anyone had any issues with those minutes? No? Anyone online? No? Okay, then we go on to item 5, which is the public questions. We've had none received, so we shall move on to item 6, which is the discussion on the cabinet reports of the annual budget. We have with us Councillor Ralph Stewart, Leader of the Council, and welcome. And we also have online Mr. Ben Smith, who's the Director of Finance. I'm sure that the leader would like to start off with his comments on the budget, and then we will have a technical report from Mr. Ben Smith, and then open for questions. Thank you.
Chair, can I just check, because obviously on the agenda you've got pre-decisions. Apologies, that's the cabinet agenda. Yeah, in terms of the overall budget, as you'll see, significant sums proposed to go into education, social care, and place-based services. But whilst the overall quantum of investment of 35 million net is significant and probably one of the largest single investments in services, it has to be seen in the context of the fact that we have very, very high inflation that we haven't seen for decades. So whilst they are significant sums in terms of cash, they are still against the pressures that everybody's feeling, both in terms of energy costs, cost of living costs, and general inflation. In terms of the energy cost itself, as you'll see, we've made a decision to establish a fund to assist with energy pressures, and that will provide assistance to schools, to care homes, to other providers of services, including leisure providers, because we know that they are likely to be hit by significant bills this year. You'll know that public sector were specifically excluded from the UK government energy scheme in the latest round of updates to that scheme. So the help that's available for this council and its services is to the value of zero at the present time. So that's why we've taken the decision to make that fund available to try and offset some of those pressures and help departments with the challenges that they have. In terms of capital, obviously, we still have a significantly large capital programme, still one of the biggest in Wales. But again, in that, there are a number of items where you'll see some slowing down of spend on that, and they for various reasons. Some on a timing issue in terms of schemes that are coming to conclusion, and obviously we want to ensure that the delivery of those schemes is to the standard that we expected, and therefore we're making sure that the snagging works and other works are completed to the specified standard. In others, it's a timing issue in terms of grant and payment, but also we're attempting with some of our schemes that are in the pipeline to avoid the highest peaks of the inflationary pressure. So it's a combination of things that are at play in the capital programme, still significant, and obviously we've made really good progress in recent years with our schools programme, and of course we're working with Welsh Government on the future elements of delivery, including the proposed changes to the MIM programme, which obviously we're working through at the present time. So overall, Chair, it's a significantly significant budget in terms of cash, but it does come with the pressures. So again, very happy to come back and answer questions. Mr. Smith, I will no doubt take you through technically each of the elements, and I'll obviously come in to answer any questions that members have as we go through. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Leader. Can Mr. Smith? If we can do the revenue budget first, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to join online today for reasons that I've explained to you, so that is much appreciated. In terms of the, you want the revenue budget first? Well, can I start by just very briefly mentioning, because you've got them starred, the budget monitoring report, which indicates that it's damage limitation in terms of those inflationary pressures which the Leader has referred to in the current year. I don't think I need to give any further technical advice on the third quarter monitoring report, because I alluded to quite a bit of it when I came before you for the second quarter. The second running report is the medium-term financial plan, which has a raft of planning assumptions in it. They are important because all of these things interlock. Assumptions that are made on future revenue support grant will determine the long-term affordability of the capital programme in terms of borrowing, which the Leader has referred to, and the affordability of a range of longer-term proposals. So I think the medium-term financial plan, I should just briefly mention it in sequence, because there are very material uncertainties, and we are in the position, if I jump between the budget monitoring report and the MTFP, we do not know teachers' pay for the current year, let alone next year. We do not know local government pay for next year. So with that indulgence in terms of very briefly skipping over the high level items, as it were, I think it's important that I give you that advice in terms of the proposals before I turn to the main item, which is the revenue budget report. I will come back if there are any specific questions on the MTFP in due course, but I think, as always, the meat of the argument is in the revenue budget proposals as set out. I'm picking up on the Leader's theme. Yes, it is a bit very much deja vu, isn't it? We had this in council last year where there was a nominally very large increase in revenue support grant, but it didn't keep pace with inflation. I think we're going to have exactly the same again, as every authority in the land, both in Wales and in England, is seeing. And that feeds through into, notwithstanding a large headline nominal increase in revenue support grant, many pressures which result in a range of council tax increases that you're all going to still find very challenging when you try to weigh the impact on the cost of living for residents versus making sure the council avoids its own cost of living crisis. So in terms of that general preamble, other than that, I'll take you through some technical advice on the report itself. Section 1.6 indicates quite clearly on page 65, picking up on the Leader's theme, yes, there's £25 million just under coming out, but there is £60 million being added in, making a net nominal £35 million added, nearly as substantial as last year's. But again, that is still challenging for us given the very elevated high levels of inflation. I won't repeat what's referred to in section 2, which is the link back to the monitoring report, which I've already referenced very, very rapidly. The local government finance settlement is an interesting one. As well as the high level nominal figures, we're in the bizarre position that we had the settlement just before Christmas and we published draft proposals just before Christmas. And here we are 6 weeks on and nothing's changed. We are aware that there will be a change to the fire service funding for one of the specific grant transfers. Nothing else has yet been indicated is being added or taken away to that block grant. And that's going to be important, particularly in the context of national negotiations over teachers' pay, because I'm not party to that. It's a national decision, but clearly Welsh ministers are deciding and taking action with unions over what could be reopened in terms of the current year's pay award. One-off, which will be by specific grant, but I'm still a little bit uncertain as to how the consolidated element will be rolled forward into the new year. And also the budget proposals are set on the basis of teachers' pay going up by 3.5%, which was the school teachers review body figures. and there's a clear indication that's being reopened, and I can only assume it could be reopened and probably going up given the levels of inflation that we are seeing. So to some extent, there's very limited wiggle room in base budget at this report as opposed to what was published just before Christmas, because as I re-emphasise, nothing at all has absolutely changed. And there are a raft of risks around the budget, but also some minor changes that are likely needed to be advised to Cabinet on Thursday, technical ones as a result of timing issues with such a late budget settlement yet again. Section 3.6, there's a reason some of the items are particularly in bold. I do emphasise that the overall long-term outlook remains extremely challenging, not only in nominal terms, because after this year's headline 7% plus increase in grant, it's due to go down to 3% and drop further lower than that still in future years. But the real terms impact, repeating what I said last year in Council, is probably the bigger challenge that we all face. In terms of the budget forecast in section 4, as I've indicated, 4.1, nothing is currently changed in terms of AEF, but I do anticipate a minor uplift for the fire service transfer. The important one to draw attention to, section 4.6 and table 1A, sets out my raft of assumptions in terms of future pay awards. For the avoidance of doubt, I have provided for a pay award that allows for an average 7% pay award for local government staff, in line with this year's pay award settlement. I don't know any of the figures because the unions have submitted their pay claim. National employers are yet to meet and advise on whether they're in a position to make an offer. And similarly for teachers, as I've already referenced, it's very uncertain as to what the current year 22-23 pay award is, let alone 23-24. And as you'll be aware, when we set the budget last year, inflation was expected to be low and it rocketed away and pay awards have increased significantly. So there is a double hop here. There's a catch up for the current year's pay award excess and a need to put sufficient in for next year. And at the moment, I consider I've put the minimum prudent amounts in for both of those. Both could go higher. We also face the issue of drivers in terms of the national living wage pressures, both in terms of our obligations to all providers, but especially in terms of real living wage expectations around social care providers. The energy price inflation, which the leader has referred to, we currently have £15 million in for that for the coming year. I continue to keep that under watch and I will update and advise Cabinet on Thursday on my latest estimates. We're in a position where over 90% of the energy is pre-bought for next year, for this coming year already. So I'm pretty certain I can advise on a final sum. As you will recall, when I advised Cabinet in December and in terms of scrutiny on this so far, we've taken the slightly unusual step to fund it from reserves one-off and not put it in the base. It's a technical device to make sure that I didn't force Cabinet and Council to have to make very significant base budget changes for what we still expect to be an unusual energy spike. No one expects energy to drop back down to the levels it was pre-Ukraine invasion. But I'm sure we all expect them to remain at a very elevated level. And when you read about the headlines about wholesale gas prices and electricity prices having gone down, don't forget we barely had any impact because we'd pre-bought all of this year's energy a year ago. So our inflation is to come in the current year. I identify the capital charges which are funded in revenue support grant for the Mumbles CRMP, Coastal Risk Management Programme. There's always an acronym that snips through the net, so apologies for that. My usual assumptions around demography, price and pressures, an indication of things that have changed around the Mid and West Wales Fire Authority, the other levies around the Swansea Bay Port Health Authority and the newly established corporate joint committees or relatively newly established corporate joint committees, assumptions over council tax and assumptions over council tax support scheme. So as you can see in that table highlighted in bold, £60 million in terms of funding requirements, 35 million left for net, leaving just under £25 million of savings requirements required. The rest of the report sets out a number of risks in terms of inflation. Table 1B again refers to the bulk of it being central inflation provision for energy and some increased contract costs due to those national minimum wage and national living wage increases. Moving on to section 4.12, the schools prioritisation, there was clear referencing in the settlement around an expectation of prioritisation from schools, and this council's position has not changed. If there's money clearly identifiable in the settlement, it's passed over to schools. and the proposals remain broadly the same as the December position in terms of our core funding, but we have been able to now update for anticipated increases in both pupil development grant and post-16 grant changes, which come separately and does therefore increase slightly the overall amount we can afford to recommend delegating to schools. That is summarised in table 1C, which indicates not only the amount going in, but for the avoidance of doubt, as has been picked up by the scrutiny panels in terms of the feedback we've already had, the amount that we're not in a position to be able to fund schools for. All council services are facing significant real terms cuts. Many are facing cash limit reductions, and it is only right and proper, in my view, as the technical officer, that there should be some contribution from schools. This was openly and transparently discussed with the School Budget Forum. I could never say they were ecstatic about the idea of having to cover some of the costs, but they understood the difficult position the authority was in, and that's why you have the table setting out the summary. There is no specific social care protection, but it is clear again in terms of the settlement that there is an expectation that there is a degree of protection, especially given national commitments around real living wage to all social care providers. Section 4.19 onwards indicates some of my assumptions around capital financing costs, and the only uplift I've provided for in the current coming year is the Mumble CRMP scheme. As you'll have seen in the MTFP report, there are a range of assumptions over future borrowing requirements and future assumptions over when we may borrow more money and at what rate of interest. As I've repeatedly indicated to Cabinet and to Scrutiny, given that we've borrowed £200 million plus at below 2%, it would be frankly ridiculous for me to be going into the money markets at the moment and borrowing at nearer 5% when we do sit on substantial reserves and cash balances. But that's only a temporary funding solution whilst I wait for interest rates to drop back down from their recent relatively elevated levels. In section 4.24 onwards, I indicate changes around the Fire Authority levy and the Port Health Authority levy. Both have met, and there have been some updates and changes. You will note, perhaps more wryly than many, that there is a clear distinction between the approaches taken by the three levying bodies as to the amount at which they think it appropriate to increase the levy. I will say no more. Others may wish to comment either today or at Cabinet and Council in due course. Section 4.27 sets out my calculations in relation to CTRS on the basis of the assumed level of increase in council tax of 4.95% in the report. The rest of the report goes through a range of proposals. I will assume you've read the report, so I don't think I need to give technical advice on the summary tables, but there may be questions that you ask of the consultation process and everything else. If I draw your attention to 6.5, there were some changes proposed as a result of the initial consultation and initial feedback. So 6.5 proposes base rowbacks on the savings proposals from December. You will note that comes to only a couple of £100,000. That was all that was available in terms of wiggle room for base rowbacks, simply because nothing has changed at the national settlement level. Section 7 continues to provide staffing implications, which for the avoidance of doubt are not compulsory redundancies. It's all posts at risk of being removed from the budget. So the 10 that are my own are either vacancies or applications for early retirement voluntary redundancy in train. And these are the posts that are due to be removed from the budget if progressed in full. Negotiations continue around the overall budget position and what staffing arrangements may be made and whether those that are still at risk can find alternative employment with the authority. I draw your attention to then section 7.8 onwards, which is issues, which is a whole raft of staffing arrangements, a consultation period around 7.10. Section 8 sets out my really boring but really important advice as to the adequacy of contingency fund, which is itself an earmarked reserve, and general reserves. I remain of the view that they are adequate for the purposes intended, and draw your attention in particular to section 8.7. We are an authority now approaching a £600 million net budget spend, gross near a £900 million. Those general fund balances have not moved for a number of years, and longer term they will need to be grown to be relative and proportionate to the overall revenue budget. But in a cost of living crisis, it would be unreasonable for me to ask you to consider that as a council when it comes before council in March. Similarly, contingency fund, the monitoring for the third quarter indicates it will all be spent in the current year, both the carry forward sums and in-year sums. So again, my advice at a technical level is there must be sums added to the contingency fund for planning purposes in the budget, and they are set out in the report accordingly. Section 8.13 onwards is the rest of my earmarked reserves and reviews of insurance funds. I have gone and looked at every reserve. I've reported to council in September on the adequacy of each. I've reviewed the reserves, so I am satisfied they are exactly the sums they should be at this point in time. But there is always some wiggle room over the use and deployment of reserves, especially when all members will be looking to avoid having to make unnecessarily hasty, painful decisions, but having a mind to the long-run sustainability of the overall budget and medium-term financial plan. That draws me then to the conclusions I set out in section 9 in terms of my advice on the budget requirement. The budget proposals in front of Cabinet on Thursday are priced on the basis of a 4.95% increase in council tax. I have given strong officer advice as the Section 151 officer that the range should be 4.95 to 6.95. That will not be palatable to many people, will not be palatable to the public, given the comments in the national media today around increases in council tax likely, but there is a cost of living crisis for councils as there is for households. With trebling of energy costs, with 10% plus headline inflation, with 7% pay awards, 16% increases in levies, it would take a financial magician to make that much lower than the range that it is. That will be a decision for Cabinet and Council in due course. And those of you that were on Council last year before the election should not be surprised at my officer advice. The decision was taken at Council to set a council tax increase of 1%, far away from the normal planning assumption of 5%, and I did indicate that the full 15 may be required over the full 3 years. So that range is entirely consistent with the advice I've continued to give to Council. Section 10 pulls it together in terms of summary funding, and again, you shouldn't be surprised to see that it comes to the overall need to put £60 million in, and then the savings that are taken out. Section 11 is a very long list of risks and uncertainties, and every year I seem to turn up and say my uncertainties become more uncertain. They certainly are in these unusual times. The major one is table 5, and clearly the unusual device of at the moment having £15 million centrally allocated, propped up by reserves, not base, for the device and convention to avoid forcing Cabinet and Council ultimately to be making decisions to reduce budgets for the long term, which may not be needed if those energy prices stabilise. A whole raft of the usual items that you would see. The energy one is the new one, takes you through the rest of the report, including the usual appendices, impact assessments, etc. I am at risk of losing my voice, so I will only briefly turn to Appendix A, and then I will cease my dulcet tones, which is on page 90. And there it sits in all its glory and horror. The leader is absolutely right. There is substantial amounts of money going into the budget, and that must not be understated. But you are all aware there is an inflationary burden. So with the money that is available, the budget has been constructed on the basis that corporate services cash limits are going down, predominantly as a result of ending of earmarked reserves. Finance looks like it's going up a bit, but when you strip out council tax reduction scheme, that is also a cash limit reduction. The place budget is down very, very materially, but that is impacted by the cessation of some one-off reserves, a likely lower drawing from the ERF, the Economic Recovery Fund, and obviously most of the savings proposals which are income related relate to income generation in the place budget, and budgets are set net. As has been indicated by both the panels that have reviewed education and social services, you will note that the two biggest statutory core services are both up over £10 million in cash. You will see the very large increase in central inflation. I assure you it's not my central jam jar pot. It is because of those very high levels of energy inflation, and I thought it prudent to hold it centrally and decide to allocate it in year. The rest of it in terms of the usuals around levies, the assumption over a slight increase in capital financing charges as a result of the Mumble CRMP scheme. It all washes through, it balances, and at the moment is at a council tax increase of 4.95%. And then we go on to the assumptions around use and draws of reserves. Again, for the avoidance of doubt, ordinarily these are very static. And given the time available, we don't anticipate all of the known draws from reserves. So, for example, I've seen feedback that says schools plan to draw up to £18 million. That is referenced there, but not reflected. Decisions over the use of contingency in 22-23 monitoring are not reflected there because we haven't drawn them down yet. So it will look lower draws from reserves than I perhaps warned council in terms of my assumptions if there wasn't a very significant increase in revenue support grant. But you should not underestimate the very significant draws that are going to come from earmarked reserves in the current year and next year, not only from the council, but from schools as a whole. I will pause there, Chair, because I've cantered through 2 reports very quickly and the main report at some length, and you probably are bored of hearing my voice.
I'm sure nobody's ever bored of hearing your voice, Ben. It's your dulcet tones are welcomed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ben, for that report. I just wanted to come back to what you said about interest rates, because I think it's very prudent, obviously, that you rely on the cash reserves rather than borrowing more money, given that interest rates are going up. You did say, however, that you expected the interest rates to come down again at some stage. Given that the rate of inflation remains high and looks like it will be driven at that sort of level by energy prices for some time to come, do you anticipate interest rates falling to a more acceptable level in the near future, or are you thinking a more medium term?
I am most definitely thinking medium term. You're right, Councillor Black. I mean, there is some inflationary pressure still hardwired in. It will get worse when the energy cap goes from £2,500 to £3,000 in April. But there is also, as I'm sure many of you are aware, an arithmetical certainty that inflation is almost bound to halve as a result of the dropping out of the very substantial increases in domestic energy bills. So I do expect I do expect inflation to drop, but to be relatively sticky for the next year. The Bank of England is sort of said it expects it to drop, but then has said it might be a bit more sticky. I do expect 2 to 3 years inflation to be back down to more what we've been used to, and it's that sort of time frame over the medium term that I expect interest rates to drop down to a more acceptable level. We are not going to see, unless there is an absolute economic calamity, a return to sub 2% borrowing rates for 50 years. I think I filled my boots as much as I could. I'm not allowed to borrow in advance of need, but I need that interest rate to be back down to 3 point something for it to be prudent for me to lock in the next lot of borrowing for future generations. And we are today facing PWLB rates of between 4.5% and 5%, and we may have peaked on base rates, but there may be one more to come. So I am very much thinking over the lifetime of the medium-term financial plan, and therefore in the meantime sitting on my hands the whole point in time, which is going to draw down significance of levels of reserves and cash. But we're in the very fortunate position that we start with those in the books and in the jam jars.
So given the capital programme which we have in front of us, are you anticipating having at some stage to borrow at rates above 4% in the near future?
No, I am content that the current capital programme, which is going through to Cabinet, is predicated on the basis of affordability, given cash balances and reserves that I have got. If Cabinet were in due course, or Council were to consider new schemes which were to add materially to the capital programme as set out through the usual FPR7 process, then there will be an additional ask of capital and an additional ask of capital borrowing, and there may come a point where I have to borrow that money. And that's one of the rate limiting steps I have. I've indicated throughout the reports, I mean, effectively in the MTFP, I've made a planning assumption that there'll be £50 million worth of additional borrowing, which will be financed at a cost of no more than 6%, which is 3.5% interest rates and 2.5% MRP. It's for Cabinet and Council to decide on the overall level of borrowing. It's for Cabinet and Council to decide on the relative balance between revenue and capital. But at the moment, I'm content that the proposals in front of you today and through to Cabinet and through to Council are affordable and can be accommodated within the very substantial reserves and cash balances we've got. It only becomes an additional concern for me of having to go and borrow earlier than I would like and at elevated rates if there were materially higher levels than the assumptions I've set out in the medium-term financial plan, Councillor Black.
Sorry, MRP?
Minimum revenue provision. So again,
Right,
because
okay.
we borrow loans only repaid on maturity, we have to prudently set aside money through the intervening period to make sure the cash is there when the loan is finally repayable to the commissioners of the PWLB, as was.
Okay, thank you. One more question in relation to paragraph 6.5. I'm asking this, really, as the chair of Scrutiny Committee. One of these savings which we're rowing back on is £195,000 for legal and democratic services. It says highlighted in Appendix D. I haven't been able to marry up that £195,000 with the figures in Appendix D. Are you able to highlight which ones we rowed back on in Appendix D at all?
So it's partly, Councillor Black, because on a page 95, the review of legal services figure has been reduced down from a high number to a lower number. The one that's reduced down to 32,000, then there was an income adjustment. So the items that have been rowed back on are predominantly legal officers, lawyers, more than other proposals at this point in time. But that's why you can't easily see the read across to the figure quoted in the table, because if you go back to the December report, you'll have seen a much higher figure for that legal entry than the £32,000, which is italicised. Anything that is italicised in those appendices has either been removed or reduced or changed in some way, shape or form. So I am satisfied that the rollbacks are in base are correct as summarised in that table, but for the avoidance of doubt at this stage, they are predominantly lawyers.
So the proposal is still to cut money from the democratic services and scrutiny support staff.
There are still proposals that are live in the budget. That is a matter for Cabinet to determine on Thursday and ultimately Council in due course.
Okay.
I think on this particular time, I think we should bring in the leader.
Thank you, Chair. Just to be helpful here, obviously Cabinet may decide on Thursday to make further amendments to the budget, and therefore you shouldn't assume at this point in time that what you're seeing on that page is the totality of any changes. So just make that point generally. On the item that you've identified there, just to add a bit more clarity to that, when we'd looked further at those savings, they potentially would have meant us having to procure legal advice externally at a more inflated cost. So in that respect, it would not have delivered the saving, and therefore it's been rolled back.
Thank you, leader. I think you had your answer, Councillor Black. Any further questions? Councillor Michael Locke.
Right, my question is to Mr. Smith. What do you project will be the reserves at the end of the financial year 23-24?
So that's a proper tea leaf reading question, isn't it, to some extent, because I've got to factor in my assumptions over the current year and next year. But given we've got 160 odd million pounds worth of earmarked reserves at this point in time, and I am on the record as indicating that in the advice I'm going to give to Cabinet on Thursday, that there is a 23 million pound draw from our own reserves. There is a further 15 million pound for the energy fund. There are a raft of reserve draws here. I do believe the 18 million pounds for schools may be drawn over 2 years. So my assumption is that earmarked reserves will, at the end of 23-24, when we report outturn, be down to the 100 million pound mark. So you're talking 70 million pounds drawn from schools reserves, insurance reserves, our ERF, and a whole raft of other reserves. That is unprecedented in one sense for this authority. And it's a very good question to ask, because people do always say, well, why can't councils just spend their reserves? Well, the budget is set on that basis. And in ordinary times, I couldn't sanction 70 million pounds planned to draw from reserves over 2 years. But of course, we've had three very unusual years. The year before COVID, we added 17 million pounds to earmarked reserves. And then the following 2 years, we added nearly another 80. So we have added that sort of amount over the period of time. So having benefited from some of the COVID generosity from Welsh Government and others, and tucked money aside in reserves, I think it is right and proper that we use some of those to stabilise the budgets that this council faces, because we had the impact of the pandemic. We had massive economic disruption, which was supported from Westminster through to the Welsh Government, through to ourselves in terms of rates relief and a whole raft of business grants and help to individuals with cost of living payments. But those are all now falling out, and there will continue to be very substantial economic disruption. The most obvious one is those high levels of inflation, the high levels of interest rates relative to what we've been used to since 2008. So that gives you a flavour of the scale of the deployment of our reserves that are being utilised. They still, by inference, remain large for an authority of this size. But they've got to last for forever, because once they're spent, they can't be ordinarily replenished. We have had 3 very, very unusual years where we've added £100 million to earmarked reserves over that period of time. And I would remind that as earmarked reserves are significantly drawn down, the weight I attach to the bit in the report, which I've said in bold, I'm prepared to leave general fund reserves assessed as adequate at £10 million. But you can see over the years I've been the Section 151 officer, The budget's grown from 400 and something million to 500 and something million. The risks have increased, and £10 million worth of general reserves would last this council less than a week, which is why, although they're tempting to be on balance sheet and potentially pilfered for emergencies, there is a reason why treasurers do like to hoard their jam jars for deployment in extreme times. And that's exactly what this budget is proposing to do, both in terms of the monitoring for the current year and next year. And of course, some of the assumptions in the medium-term financial plan. I've indicated that because I plan to sit on my hands in terms of not going and locking in at high interest rates, I am deploying the capital equalisation reserve all the way through the life of the medium-term financial plan. So it's quite a long answer, but I think it's an important one, because I think you very astutely asked a question that will be of interest to a wide range of viewers and commentators, Councillor. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chair, I was going to make a similar point to Mr. Smith in terms of the, if you like, the variances from the norm in terms of that extra £100 million going in and now money being drawn out. So there has been that variance, but for obvious reasons in terms of COVID, additional monies, and then the need to support as we come out of COVID. I think a couple of other things I would draw members' attention to, though, in the granularity. The Energy Fund isn't a magic money tree that we found somewhere. It is the Economic Recovery Fund that we had intended to use to support community projects, community schemes across Swansea. It is a redirection of funding that we had in reserves locally that we were planning to deploy anyway this year and next to assist with community priorities that members would have been feeding into that scheme as they'd done in the previous year. We're having to do that because we've been excluded from the energy help provided by UK government. So it's a redirection of our reserves to do that purpose. And, you know, it is frustrating that we weren't able to access the help from UK government and that we were excluded. And therefore, I think we're doing the decent thing, which is prioritising the energy help over the funding that we would otherwise have been able to provide. But we were still planning to use those reserves, albeit in a different way. Likewise, we've had debates in this meeting and others before around the capital equalisation reserve. That is a reserve that was set up to be drawn from. So again, that was intended for us to draw reserves. So I do agree, Mr. Smith, it is odd in terms of its scale, but draw from reserves was always a plan for this period of redevelopment and investment. So that is something that should be borne in mind. Chair, if you will allow me as well, I was planning to make a comment as well around the levies, because Mr. Smith did mention that. I think it just, I made statements at Cabinet and elsewhere. I did make them directly to the chair and officers of the Fire Authority. Whilst we've all got huge respect for officers in the Fire Authority, they have to balance as well the ask that they place upon this council and upon the taxpayers of Swansea in terms of the pressures, the cost of living pressures, the energy pressures that everybody is facing, in the same way as we're having to do in setting our budget. And just for those who aren't budget nerds like myself, obviously the difference between the Fire Authority levy and the Police Authority levy is the Police Authority levy is added in addition and doesn't come out of the council tax funds, whereas the Fire Authority does. Now, this year, that's circa £2.6, £2.7 million gross, about £2.2 million net that we're having to find from within this authority to fund the fire service. That means before we even discuss council tax, that's 2% that we need to find in council tax terms. And that's the reality of how the funding mechanisms work here. So I have cautioned, I have lobbied, I have pleaded with those in the Fire Authority to take a more considered views, to potentially do like we're doing, to use more of their reserves in this difficult time. I don't say for a moment that they aren't going through difficult times, they are. But that money will have to be found either by cutting jobs in this authority, which I personally am not prepared to go along with, or for us to look at other ways of raising revenue. So it is, unfortunately, going to be a major factor in how we set council tax this year.
Thank you, Leader. Can I have any further members' questions? Oh, Stan.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask in relation to staffing implications, as it just brought it up there, in terms of the balance between posts that are already vacant and sort of people who are in post, whether it be volunteers for early retirement, voluntary redundancy, redeployment, etc. What are those proportions? Do you know, sort of an estimate, and kind of what assessment of the risk of cutting vacant posts has been undertaken in terms of, are we cutting them because they're vacant, but there is a risk to future service delivery? You know, had we filled them, has that, you know, how has that been assessed? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Fogarty. In terms of the balance, my understanding is there's between 40 and 50% of those posts are either vacant or filled with people who are have indicated they would be interested in ER/VR. So in that respect, the numbers, if you like, of posts at risk are lower. But again, Cabinet hasn't made its final decision yet. I mean, obviously you have the report before you today, but there are other decisions that Cabinet will be weighing up ahead of Thursday around whether there are any further movements to this planned budget that we can make that may help, again, in reducing the impact on FTEs. In previous years, we've been very successful working with colleagues, working with unions and others to try and make sure that where posts are impacted and where there's an individual in there who's either unable to accept or go for ER/VR, that we work through redeployment and retraining to find them a new role within the authority and avoid compulsory redundancies wherever we can. So that is something we will do again in terms of that programme. In terms of posts at risk, in terms of future risks from that, I think, again, I rely on officer advice on this, but what we've tried to do in discussion of these roles has been to go for roles that don't introduce that additional risk, and that officers believe those functions can be shared between the remaining resource. But of course, we've been through 10 years of austerity, which has made that process incredibly difficult. What I would say, though, is in terms of risks that we're carrying, and I'm sure members would have heard it yesterday in the social services session, it's the fact around the inability to recruit, even though the resources are there, I think is one of the biggest risks that we're carrying at the moment. Because again, we would want to see more staff coming into social services, but the challenging market where people can, go and work for a supermarket or other retailer and get a similar wage to that they'd be paid in social care is a matter that should concern us all. And that's why we're keen to work with the Welsh Government to look at how we can change the system around that and make it more attractive to come into social care so that we can fill those vacancies. But if you're asking me where I think the risks in the overall employment and staffing are for the authority at the moment, I would say social care has to be the standout in terms of we are trying to recruit but finding it very difficult.
I think also need to be pointed out that in yesterday's scrutiny board, where we scrutinised social services, staffing was a major issue, and also delayed employment of staff as well helps with that savings as well. It's quite a difficult process to employ social workers, care workers, etc. And the leader is right. There is a market supplement in many cases being paid by other authorities to entice social workers, especially in the children's services. We've done that in the past, and we've been reasonably successful. But like everything else, once one authority does it, it keeps on ratcheting up, and the consequences of that are quite significant. But the staffing issues in social services, as the leader has pointed out, is not just in our sphere, it's also in the private sector sphere. And that's where, we have some issues with the fees as well. So the employment issue and the staffing issue is quite relevant, and right across the board, both in the council itself, plus also in the private sector. So Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the consultation on the budget. I noticed you don't appear to have consulted on the proposal to increase the charges for parking in the city centre, presumably because that decision was taken back in November by Cabinet. What representation have you received about city centre parking charges, given the very precarious state of the city centre retail offer at the moment?
Sorry, Chair. I think we did consult on parking charges specifically around the app in terms of the discount being applied to residents parking as to parking charges.
Yeah, but not city centre charges. I'm just looking. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of city centre, actually, in terms of our consultation with BID and other parties, whilst nobody would want to see parking go up, we've had an effective dialogue there around the fact that we hadn't increased car parking charges for nearly 8 years. They were around 22% lower in real terms than where they would be had inflationary increases occurred. And it's part of a wider range of measures. So what we had in terms of feedback, specifically from BID and some of their representatives, was actually changes to things like Sunday parking, etc., were ones that were less concerning to them than things like the removal of free buses to the city centre or reduced park and ride. Now, businesses reported a very strong trading position over Christmas, which is good to see. And again, part of that appears to have been the ability of people to get into the city centre on free buses during that period, and that has certainly assisted. So it's about how we deploy the limited resources we've got. We have made a commitment prior to the election to introduce a citizens app, which will provide ongoing and regular benefits to people. And of course, they're proposed to be applied to city centre parking charges, as well as parking charges across the city, so that every time a resident parks, they pay a different rate and a lower rate to those who may be visiting the city. In addition to that, we will also continue to work with BID, and I'll decline interest as obviously a director of BID, but we'll continue to work with BID to ensure that we have appropriate offers which are worked up in conjunction with city centre businesses, and that's something we've done now for a number of years, because what we want to do is to make sure whatever help we can provide, or whatever discount or proposal we can provide, promotion, is something that the businesses feel is the most appropriate one for them at that time of year. So that's what we'll continue to do.
Well, what's the timescale for this app to come in?
So the new parking rates and the app is already, I believe, live in some respects. It may be going through its beta at the moment, but residents will be able to access the My Permit app to take advantage via the app of the resident discount. But also, I believe April the 1st, it'll be rolled out on the machines across the city, or from April the 1st. So all they'll need to do is to input their registration and then choose the residence fee in order to then qualify for the application. Sorry, for the discount.
So they pay for the app as well then?
They can do it through the app, or they can do it at the machine.
Okay, because it seems to me that yeah, I mean, fair enough, you're putting a lower rating for residents, but the city centre itself depends on a wider catchment area outside the city. So I'm concerned that people coming into the city to shop will decide to go elsewhere because they're paying more for the city centre, and that's the concern. When by having this two-tier thing, you're putting off non-residents from coming to the city centre.
Well, it's about how you use the discounts and incentives. I think we were facing, as you know, a historical position where £180 million of spend from people within Swansea was going outside of the county. So I think one of our first choices was to make sure it was attractive for residents in the city. And very much the ethos that we've got is, if you live in Swansea, you should get a benefit from being a resident over those who choose to visit this fantastic city we're lucky to represent. So that's the first thing. It's about a principle of saying you should get a benefit from being here anyway. And then it's about the balance, about what the costs of parking or other services are in Swansea compared to elsewhere. We know already, if you look at council tax, the ratepayers in Neath Talbot will pay over £200 a year more for their services than they do living in Swansea. You know that if you go and park in cities like Cardiff or Newport, you will pay more to park there than you will in Swansea. But even in Swansea, if you choose a council car park, you'll pay less than you will for NCP and other providers. So there are various choices to be made here. But I think the point about saying, look, there are cheap ways to visit Swansea, park and ride being reduced to £1. So, for those who want to now make use of a wonderful park and ride, they can do so for £1. That means if there's 4 people sharing a car, that's 25p each. And you just put that against, because of course you put that against online shopping, and online shopping operators have now started to increase their charges for return items. And we were in a meeting yesterday with retailers where they were saying they are seeing change in habits, where people are starting to drift back more to actual physical shopping, which is good to see. On the basis that it's now expensive for them to send things back if they order them online. So, you know, if you order something from Amazon, it can cost you £3.95 at least to get an item delivered. Well, actually, it would only cost you £1.40 or £1.55 to park in the city. So by comparison, it's still cheaper than the alternative. I think there is a perception there, though, that we are more expensive than other areas to shop. We are not. And I think, you know, it's amongst all of us to make sure that the promotions and the offers that we put on are ones that are well promoted to people, so they understand how cheap it is actually to come in and spend a day in the city centre.
Are you proposing to extend the park and ride facilities, maybe put a provision in from the west?
Yeah, we're currently consulting on that. And as you know, the only thing that's really prevented us from doing something in the west of Swansea has been the availability of land, specifically down towards the Mumbles area. We're still very keen to try and deliver that facility so that we have a park and ride there. But we're also looking at a number of sites for additional park and rides as part of that integrated transport policy.
Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, you were at the Social Services Panel meeting yesterday. You obviously have referred to a couple of things there. I just would reiterate the concerns that we had as a panel, particularly around the proposed savings in terms of vacancy posts and agency staff and the balance of that. There was some discussion. I don't know if you were there at the time, because you did. I'm not sure if you were there at the end when we talked about decommissioning of services, which is going to go on effectively in the near future, as we understand it, which will potentially have an impact, but doesn't seem to be built into the budget this year. We weren't told that it was particularly, but just to say, I'm sure that both the these social services scrutiny panels will continue to monitor very closely these changes and see what the impact is, and see if how detrimental they've been or how effective or beneficial they've been. And we'll monitor them very closely. I think that's all I wanted to say, Chairman. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Leader.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I mean, you'll know that if you go through the papers, you'll see that social services gets the biggest proportional share of the budget in terms of percentage terms this year, in terms of uplift, and that's right, given the pressures that they are facing. What I'd say, though, generally, I mean, it's all very well to have a discussion about the individual bits of a Swansea Council budget, but there's a much bigger challenge for all of us here. We've seen health under pressure this year across the country. We had been offered a full review of social care and funding through the national insurance system by previous prime ministers and previous governments in London. That seems to have been unwound, and it doesn't seem to be actually going anywhere. And I think, you know, we've got to be real about this. If we want to have something akin to the National Health Service that sits alongside the National Health Service, that is as important as the National Health Service, then we need a national care system or national care service. That is what we need to move to, because currently we have essentially a very disparate independent or private sector organisation which is not working effectively. We're constantly in the position of having to move packages of care between independent providers, and there is profit that is in that system that is being taken out and not reaching patients. So, you know, I think as our population continues to age, as more of us need social care, the government in the UK, which is the only government that really can make this happen, given the scale and the need for the investment to go in, has to grasp the nettle and has to reform social care. And that will provide inevitably consequentials to the Welsh government, who I'm sure will want to do exactly the same thing. And, you know, I would just urge that we cannot continue to ignore the fact that we need significant structural change in how we deliver social care.
If I can come back, Chairman, just for a second, just to say that obviously we did welcome the increase in the social services budget this year, but our job specifically yesterday was to look at what's in that budget and to comment on it. And whilst we understand what the leader is saying in terms of the overall schemes of things, our discussion yesterday had to be far more parochial as a result of what we were doing and reporting back to you for you to take back to Cabinet tomorrow or on Thursday. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, thanks. If I can refer back to the reserves, and thanks for clarification that we've got, I think you said 160 million of usable reserves. It's going to go down to 100 million. But actually on page 72, just clarification with regards to the capital equalisation reserve. I can actually see that there's an underspend on capital charges of at least £8 million. You know, we're in a beneficial position as far as I understand with regards to capital charges. When is there going to be a tipping point when these capital charges, you know, this 8 million is not going to carry on every year? So is it actually going to go down, and is there going to be a point where that moves into, shall we say, negative territory because of the MRP, for instance?
So perhaps if I come in there, I'm struggling to find the page that you're referring to, Councillor. Apologies. Was it the reserve schedule you said? Yeah, in terms of capital equalisation reserve. You're right. I mean, this is a perennial question that you ask me, and we debate. Yeah, in the monitoring report, there is an £8 million forecast underspend on capital financing in the current year. That is primarily, I'll use the word that I've used before, temporal, and I have to weigh the intertemporal effects going forward. The MTFP assumes £6 million of that £8 million is spent already to avoid me having to go back out and borrow from the PWLB over the lifetime of the MTFP. So most of that £8 million windfall is already taken into account. It is also undoubtedly the case that if at any point I do have to borrow more money, if I had to borrow it today, I'm going to have to borrow it at 5% rather than 1.89% as a result of some fairly seismic base rate changes and economic disturbance. I won't use anything more strong than that over the last year. So you'll be aware that I've always indicated there is a long-term strategy and a glide path here. And I take every opportunity, because it's in line with the advice I gave to council, and council agreed to put every penny that is underspent into the capital equalisation reserve and then to draw it down in due course. That capital equalisation reserve has to protect against future borrowing, future interest rates. It also has to fund some of the revenue costs of City Deal, because that's only capital funding. And the beauty of the CER is it's a revenue reserve, so I can flip between revenue and capital at will. It's in our control as a council rather than have to go and seek ministerial capitalisation directions. The long-term path is that capital financing costs will continue to increase budget-wise. There will be several years still of likely underspending on capital financing. You've only got to take one look at the budget monitoring report to see that at the third quarter, there's £100 million worth of underspend at that point in time on the current year's capital programme. And I perennially say to this committee and to Cabinet, I rub my hands in glee, because on a 4% cost of borrowing, that saves me £4 million immediately. But that's just money not yet spent. It's already committed. So that is definitely only temporal. And that tipping point comes if I'm forced to go back out and externalise the debt. The strategy is very clear. I am going to try and live off the fat of the land of the £210 million already borrowed at 1.89%, and will continue to try to bear down on the pool rate. When I took over as the Section 151 officer, the pool rate of borrowing was 6%. I'd set a target of getting it down to 4%. That was achieved for last year's budget. And spoiler alert, when the capital strategy and treasury management strategy comes in March, you will see that despite 8-9 base rate increases, the strategy has enabled me to reduce the pool rate yet further. Detail will come in due course on the 2nd of March, but by way of teaser trailer, given it's nearly Oscar season, that'll be one that will be beneficial yet again. So there will be many, many more years likely underspending in the very short term. It is also the case that we accidentally, indirectly benefit from those base rate increases, don't we? Because I've borrowed 210 million at 1-something%, and if I lend it on today, I'm not allowed to be a bank, but if I lend it on today, base rate's 4%. So I'm making an absolute mint in terms of interest on balances in the very short term on any money I don't spend. But the advice I've given to committee is always that I expected the CER to last till 2028. Then I stretched it out to 2030. Then I worried a bit because base rates rocketed away that it might be a bit shorter term. I am still trying to keep that CER topped up to get us to 2030. But for the avoidance of doubt, it definitely is still in surplus at the end of the medium-term financial plan. That will go to Cabinet and Council. which is the basis on which I'm able to make the assumption that I do not plan to borrow any of the additional money that is invariably going to need to be borrowed when we come on to discuss the capital programme in due course. So I continue to benefit the authority. The authority benefits from decisions already taken. My judgment call is it will definitely last to 27-28. I hope it still lasts to 2030. And that position will improve if it turns out to be the case that base rates have peaked and start to drop down a bit. We've already seen movements in the mortgage market where on the money markets, fixed rates are dropping. I don't benefit from that because the PWLB rates are quoted on government yields, and government yields today are between 4.5 and 4.9%, depending on how long you borrow it for. But I'm absolutely confident in the short run that there is sufficient cash and sufficient reserves to enable me not to need to go out to the market, subject to when we come on to the relatively brief officer advice I'll give on the planning assumptions in the capital budget, which will be discussed as the next item.
Leader or Mr. Lucky?
Yeah, just quickly from him, I think Mr. Smith has answered it perfectly, but I think the inferred question from Councillor Jones was around, will the money run out or will we run out of cash? I think Mr. Smith has been very eloquent in saying no. In fact, we're adding more cash in the short term because of the way in which we borrowed and therefore are able to actually add to the capital equaliser reserve and other reserves as a result. And, that is a really good position. I think Mr. Smith was absolutely correct in his advice a few years ago when he said, we don't think we can lose on borrowing at that rate in terms of pre-borrowing for the schemes we know we were going to do. And therefore, that has proved to be absolutely correct because it allows us not only now to lock in that rate, and again, I'm very pleased that we have been able to go below 4% in terms of the pool rate, which, of course, is a sort of significant benefit to the future liabilities of this council, but also it allows us to get through the peak of the current borrowing rates, which of course were caused by the disastrous Kwarteng Trust budget in London that drove up interest rates. So the point I'm making is there is a short-term peak here, which Mr. Smith has already said in terms of interest rates, and hopefully Mr. Smith will not need to borrow whilst that peak is in place.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Jones? I've got a number of questions. I'm not sure who will be able to answer them, really. It is welcoming the 8% increase in social services. The capital finance charges, I understand, obviously, the seawall, we are the improvements in the seawall in Mumbles is going to be directly funded through a CRPM, which is 1556. Yeah, is in the narrative in the report in the beginning, it says the capital charges are going to go up by a nominal 1.6, but when you look at Appendix A, it shows a 3 million increase. Ben, why the difference?
There are already planned increases in capital financing from the previous MTFP. So the next year's budget only starts from the position that was already agreed as the starting position. So there is a planned increase in capital financing throughout, as there is in the existing MTFP. I've now deferred it in terms of the advice for future MTFP, other than for the Mumble CRMP scheme, because we're effectively on site and being financed for that. Again, unusually, where we have to borrow all the money, albeit we'll internally borrow the money in the first instance, because we've been given it specifically as effectively a ring-fenced component of revenue support grant, albeit revenue support grant isn't really ring-fenced, if you get what I mean.
Sorry, within that table, I'll get it now in a minute. Sorry. On table 1A, projected pressures, there's a line in there which MTFP service pressure accepted 1.9 million. What does that mean?
So that's a whole raft of service-specific proposals put forward by directors that are added into the individual cash limits set out in the appendix of individual budget items. It's a raft of items. I mean, in a normal year, we would look to have very significant numbers of those, but for the avoidance of doubt, I've only been able to fund pay awards and and energy, and only a small number of service-specific asks. So they've already been added in. We don't routinely identify them line by line because some of them are fingernails of
But
tens of
that's
thousands of pounds.
that's normally in the appendixes, isn't it? Where the detail of that is.
Yeah, and the
But we don't normally put in MTFP service pressures in the overall pressure, projected pressures, do we?
We do reflect the figures that are likely to go into future years' budgets. If you track back, you will see a figure each year, but the budget proposals reflect those that have already been approved on my advice and recommended to Cabinet when they set the budget initially in December, and will continue to consider it in later this month and into March. So it is normal for there to be some service pressures accepted.
Yeah,
Many
but
of them.
Sorry, go on.
As I say, but they're still relatively small in the grand scheme of things because I've just got limited affordability as to what I can deploy into service budgets, and that's why you see such a huge ballooning in the central inflation provision. And why I'm giving advice that members should put as much as they can afford into contingency, and notwithstanding that we know that in the short term we're underspending on capital financing, that we mustn't shortchange that because those future costs are locked in. That was all I was going to say, Chair. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, thank you. The other questions I think are for the leader. Obviously the car parking charges, we understand you've already stated that, but you've got them in 3 different headings, and I wondered why, if you could explain that. The first one is additional car parking, 250,000. Then you've got one charges for non-city centre parking standardisation of 100,000, and then a foreshore car parking increases of 350,000. So I was wondering if you could explain to committee what those 3 different ones are, so that we are aware of that. If you could at the same time, there's a marina and Nabrock increase of 440,000. I'm assuming that's for berthing. And then the other one then is, which is a comment, is about the increase in the market rents to 30,000. Is that a good idea, considering we do have empty stalls?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In terms of the 3 headings from the car parking, it's somewhat historic in terms of there are 3 different elements to parking that we have. Obviously, we have some outlying car parks. Let's deal with that one first of all. They're in some locations around the county, and they've traditionally been free car parks on the basis that they have competing car parking, which is free nearby, and therefore it seemed pointless to pursue that in terms of its impact on the localities that they were in. So that was the proposal around that, and again, Cabinet are looking at some of the more recent evidence in terms of usage and potential impact as part of that. The second one is the foreshores. Well, obviously, we've had different regimes operate in the foreshores to things like the city centre. And as you know, we implement different proposals on those during the winter and the summer months. So again, they're shown slightly separately. And again, we're looking as part of the reorganisation of the parking model to account for things like overnight parking, for instance, in both city centre and in foreshore locations, and trying to look at what we can do to support recreational vehicle parking as well, where that's appropriate. So that's the rationale for the separate headings there. Mr. Smith will have to give you an answer on the one. I think you are right. It may be berthing or contract terms, and then I'll come back on the markets if that's all right.
So the only thing I would add, as well as what the leader has said in terms of, yes, there are historical reasons, but it's also because they're budgeted for separately in separate cost centres. And if I lumped it all in as one line, you would not have enough granularity to work out what those proposals were. So as well as the historical reasons for it and the fact that they are stratified different types of car parking operations, they crucially flow through into different cost centres and different programme areas in the budget papers at the appendix set out in the budget report.
I was quite aware of that, but the reason I ask is because many other people wouldn't know, because originally the foreshore car parks were under leisure services.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they were under leisure services is because of Nabrock and the fact that they were going to be used for different activities, and the RV ones that you mentioned were ones that were highlighted many years ago, and nobody's got around to doing that yet. But it's good that you're thinking of that. On the market.
Yeah, on the market, I think, look, it is a tricky one. Obviously, rents, like all others, have gone up as part of the inflationary pressures that people face. What we've tried to do is to balance that with, trying to support the market. You'll know we produced a significant package of help throughout COVID for market traders to help them through. And again, the proposals that are there are for ones that are below inflationary increases in terms of the market rents, to try and ensure that we strike the right balance, as we're trying to do with council tax and all other things, in terms of trying to protect the income that funds services for the council, and obviously not placing too heavy a burden on those that pay those fees. So that's the challenge. We're always open to further discussions. But I would also point out that the market has and continues to have a high occupancy rate. There is, still a lot of demand for stalls in the market, and it is a jewel in the crown of Swansea, and we want to do all we can to strike that right balance to continue to support it. But also, we cannot unfortunately ignore the pressures that we're under ourselves in terms of needing to raise income to continue to invest in services.
Okay, thank you, Leader. The only other one I'll pass comment on is, and ask for an explanation, because this is not, we are not here to pass comment on the rights and wrongs of it. We are here to make inquiries. That inquiry is about the pest control fee going up by 15% for schools and contracts. Surely, given the fact that now we will be serving considerably more meals in our schools, in our primary schools, pest control fee are going up by 15% for schools. Surely that is going to put extra pressure on those schools. And I would have thought an inflation increase 10% at the most would have been appropriate. Can we have your views on that, please?
Yeah, I'll check back in terms of when previous fees were increased, but I think the thinking here was that it was a fee consistent with the pressures that are there on the service. And of course, what we've been trying to do is maintain the service at the current level. And as you say, it will face more demands in that respect. We cannot run the current service or the service at the level that would be required without an increase in funding, and that has to be passed on to the users of that service. So we do have a principle that we do not try and move pressures around the authority, because that doesn't raise extra money. But in this respect, given the way in which the service will have to respond to increased demands, as you say, it will need additional resources in order to do that.
Thank you very much, Leader. Are there any other questions on this revenue budget? If not, can I move on to the next part of this, and that is the capital budget and programme. Mr. Smith, would you like to go through it?
Thank you, Chair. You'll be pleased to know I'm going to be very brief. This is a capital report that sets out very clearly just shy of £400 million worth of general fund capital programme, and sets out how it is intended to be financed. So Appendix A shows the total at 398,349,000. Appendix B, as I say, summarises the financing, and in relation to questions, I think, from both Councillor Black and Councillor Jones, if you look at Appendix B, you'll see the unsupported borrowing requirement very heavily front loaded for the next couple of years, and I continue to give the advice that I am satisfied that we have sufficient already borrowed and cash backed reserves to finance that in the short run. And you will therefore see that at the moment there is no built-in unsupported borrowing requirement of any note in 24-25 or 25-26, and absolutely zero in the following 2 years. That's why I'm able to give that assurance at a technical build level. But this is a capital programme at the moment of £400 million. If I draw your attention back to Appendix A, and also draw you back to the monitoring report, we always tend to underspend on capital and then it gets rolled forward. So you've got a current just shy of £200 million, £170 million capital programme. It's £133 million in the current year on general fund. Sorry, I've made a mistake because I've added in the HRA to the 170 I've referred to in the monitoring report. But you can see that the 133 million drops to 105, drops to 56. It materially tails off because there is an explicit assumption at the moment that I've borrowed all I can afford to borrow in the short term, with one very enormous caveat. The report itself summarises the assumptions to date, and within the report, I'm just struggling to find where I've tucked it away, but there is an assumption that will be a need to borrow at least another £50 million. I've previously advised this committee, I'm entirely agnostic as to the decisions that Cabinet may recommend and Council may take on the split between revenue and capital, as long as both are affordable in the long run. In the very short run, we are rich in cash and rich in earmarked reserves, which enables me to sit on the sidelines from borrowing. The report does reference an up to additional £50 million. That should not come as a surprise. There are a large number of live capital schemes that many members around the table will be aware are under significant cost pressure because of inflation. There are also expectations in terms of new schemes coming on stream, but also obligations where we bid for levelling up. And one of the key criteria of levelling up is that the Section 151 officer of the relevant authority commits to provide guaranteed funding for the match funding element. So there is an inevitability that there will be future capital borrowing. It's not factored in explicitly. There's a theme throughout the revenue budget and the medium-term financial plan, and here that what is currently budgeted and going to be in front of Cabinet and Council is afforded and relies on that strategy of drawing down short-term cash-backed reserves. And makes an explicit assumption of up to £50 million may be sustained in the short to medium term, but will have to be borrowed at some point. And for the avoidance of doubt, necessary revenue adjustments will need to be made to afford that financing of the capital programme. It is not for me to tell Cabinet or Council what that figure should be. It is merely a planning assumption at the moment that it's 50. It could be higher, it could be lower. I suspect, given the size of the current programme and the significant tailing off set out in the report in front of you, it's more likely to be higher than lower, partly as a result of those inflation pressures, but also as a result of obligations under levelling up. Every time you win a levelling up bid, it's great to win a bid, of course it is, but every single one of them comes with a match funding requirement and will require me ultimately to go and borrow more money in due course. I think it would also be remiss of me not to recognise the point that is made in both the report and that the leader would often make, which is whilst we don't repay the debt we borrow from the PWLB until point of maturity, we set it aside under the minimum revenue provision. So we prudently set aside money. For the avoidance of doubt, I am setting aside money for MRP at 2.5% a year on general fund, which is over 40 years. All of the money I've borrowed from the PWLB has been over 48, 49 and 50 years. So by year 40, I've set aside all the money needed to repay the debt that was going to be redeemed in 50 years time. So there is often 15-16 million pounds a year of general fund minimum revenue provision, which whilst not technically repaying the debt is equivalent in cash to repaying the debt, and that does provide for a suitable amount of churn to be able to take on new debt which can be financed by future generations, because some of the old debt drops out, even if technically it doesn't drop out until the point at which it fully matures, because it's just linked to those very long dated gilts. So it's a technical answer, but it's an important answer which recognises and can be summed up as the current capital programme as presented for Cabinet and Council is affordable with some limited drawdowns, and is making assumptions that there will be future decisions to fund additional capital. What the final figure will be could be higher or lower. I don't know the figure yet because I've yet to have all of the detail before Cabinet and Council, but the main reason for not building it in is I have absolutely zero intention of borrowing any money because it's fully delegated to me to decide when to go out to the money markets and draw down the PWLB money. I have no intention of borrowing any of it through the life of the MTFP if I can get away with doing so, for the reasons I've already said about those elevated rates of interest. I want to see interest rates come down to a much more attractive level. I may eat those humble words in due course, because clearly if there were a very material drop in rates and they became very attractive like they did again previously, I might be tempted to go in early. But at the moment, my intention is not to physically borrow cash for any of the next 5 years. And effectively, it's cheaper to borrow from yourself internally than it is to externalise it at the best of times. It's definitely the case when rates are at an elevated historic high, the highest they've been since 2008. I've nothing further to add to the capital programme report in front of you in terms of technical advice. Thank you, Chair.
Leader, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Mr. Smith knows me well because I was absolutely going to make the point around the technical repayment of debt, and I think that is something we should always bear in mind when you couple that with the fact that Mr. Smith has already stated that the pool rate, the range when you take out the average of all the debt taken out historically has reduced from 6% down to 4%, now below that, as we'll see in the forthcoming report. That means that our overall cost of borrowing has reduced significantly, and we're repaying or setting aside repayments for that more historic, more expensive debt and replacing it or have replaced it with more cheap and probably the cheapest we could probably ever get debt. Now, I think that's important because our capital programme is one of the biggest in Wales and proportionally probably the biggest in Wales for our population size. So, you know, it is a significantly ambitious programme, but as Mr. Smith said, fully funded as far as he's concerned, and he's confident that everything we're committed to is funded. In addition, of course, if we are successful with further levelling up bids, and it's great to have that 18 million come in, but there are 2 other big bids that we had in there that we will be looking to resubmit, then it will come with a further requirement. But we shouldn't be shy of that requirement as long as we have that lock-in, which is it's sensible to invest because it's going to create jobs or other benefits for the economy of Swansea and the people of Swansea, but also then because it allows us to borrow within our means. As Mr. Smith has said, it becomes an affordability choice for Council and Cabinet. And I think, you know, we'll continue to do that. You'll know that we'll continue to push the ambition on the capital programme because we want to bring more to Swansea in terms of generating economy opportunities and also jobs in the new economy that we're trying to create, the green economy, the transport economy, and to try and take further the regeneration of our city centre. So for all of those reasons, as well as, of course, we want to continue with the Welsh Government in terms of investing in our schools estate, which will come at a price tag because, of course, on those schemes with the intervention rate will require contributions from us going forwards as we want to build more new and better schools for the people of our community. So for all those reasons, do expect further borrowing to take place at some point in the next few years. But again, we'll rely on Mr. Smith's excellent advice in terms of when and how that takes place.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, it's just a technical question, really, because may show how out of touch I am with these budgets. I was just looking at Appendix G, and I noticed that Director of Place is going to be purchasing a number of vehicles. Do we not lease those vehicles nowadays, or are they actual straight purchases?
It continues to be a mix. You're quite right, Councillor Black. A number of years ago, a number of items were stopped from being capital financed and gone to lease. I continue to keep all options open. Where it's appropriate to buy outright, I'll buy outright. Where it's cheaper, in my judgment, to lease it, I will lease it. Clearly, with historically low interest rates, at the end of the day, leases are financed by finance companies. It was attractive to do leasing. It becomes less attractive as base rates move materially against those financing companies, and they would have to load them on into future leasing costs. So you're absolutely right. It is a mix. And at the moment, there is a presumption there will be some outright purchases because at the moment it is cheaper to buy them outright than finance them through leasing deals. But I remain open-minded, and if things flip around again, I may reverse my position again. I'll do whatever I consider to be the cheapest, where there is a flexibility between revenue and capital, because as you know, Councillor Black, it's one of the things that's very useful to be able to acquire things that are of a broadly recognised capital nature, but capable of being put through revenue if they're operating leases. But that's the reason why there's still some in there, and it may have surprised you, given that for many years we did revert to leasing only because it was the cheapest thing to do. When base rates and the economy moves against you, sometimes you have to change your stance. I hope that clarifies the position.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Any further questions? No? I've got a question for you. I don't know if the leader wants to answer it or not. The last levelling up fund bid was successful. Do we have to match fund it?
I believe there is a match funding element. Mr. Smith may have a more up-to-date figure than I will have, so rather than give you an inaccurate figure, I'll hand over to Mr. Smith on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, my belief is that the combined match funding requirement for that one is just shy of £9 million in total. It was 2 tranches. One of them was for 1.75, 2.25 million, and the rest. So there will be an obligation. So when I'm thinking of a £50 million minimum future level of borrowing, that's the sort of level that was attached to that levelling up bid. It's just shy of £9 million from memory, and the intervention rates vary from scheme to scheme, but that gives you the sort of magnitude of just that one alone. It's great to get a headline 18, but as I say, we're going to be probably putting a third of the overall package in on that one.
So it's about 29 million, something of that nature, the levelling up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm speaking from memory, so apologies if I've misremembered.
Okay.
But I believe that to be close enough in terms of giving you an indication of whilst it's great to win individual levelling up bids, they are not insignificant. Large levelling up bids come with large large amounts of potentially having to finance your own capital.
The bid itself, we win the bid, and the bid is for, we'll say a figure, say 30 million. Do we then have to match fund it up to 40 million, or do we match fund it up to the 30 million?
It's the latter.
So it's up to the 30 million. So effectively, we get a levelling up bid of 20 million pound, and we got to put in 10 million of our own.
On that particular scheme, it does vary scheme to scheme to scheme.
I understand that, yes.
Yeah,
because
but on that one, yes, your presumption is right.
Because
Chair.
intervention rates, depending if it was European money or it's government money or whatever, there are different intervention rates. Okay, so
Yeah, I was just
Leader.
going to make a general point, which is, you know, when levelling up was first proposed, it didn't come with an obvious statement that, you know, communities that needed levelling up were going to have to commit their own resources into it. It does seem counterintuitive in terms of the aims of levelling up. I'll say no more on that because I know it's not a political committee, but I just think, you know, it would be good to return to the days where government recognised that the investment in areas like Swansea was something that they should do at 100% intervention rate.
the very reason I asked this question, Leader, is to find out what exactly it's going to cost us, because I don't believe in free money. On the other bids that we've put in, some of them are for Urban Splash with the Civic Centre and what have you. And I understand some of them may be for our capital programme that we currently are looking at going through to 25, 26. But obviously we cannot borrow money unless we have a project, unless we have a programme for that money. So if we are saying that we potentially could borrow an extra 50 million because of fallout of our revenue finance, we must have projects for that money that we borrow. Assuming that is the case, I know that Castle Square is going to be financed by the council. Is that finance going to be part of that extra borrowing, or have we got sufficient headroom in the capitals that we have, or the cash we have now, to go ahead with that project, or will we be borrowing money to do that project?
So again, perhaps if I go first, the leader may wish to come in. For the avoidance of doubt, the amount that is budgeted for Castle Square is set out quite clearly in the capital report in front of you. That is the amount that is currently afforded. Anything that may be brought before Cabinet in due course for FPR 7 decision, or ultimately council, if it requires a substantial additional external borrowing, will be considered in due course. I have priced up on a pipeline of a range of things that are coming through, and I would expect to see those come through to Cabinet in due course through March and April. You always have FPR 7 reports coming through in year, but there are many that are going to be coming through in terms of pipeline. I'm aware of some of the cost pressures on some of them. I can't reveal the detail on them in advance of them coming to Cabinet. But it remains my judgment view that irrespective of what the pipeline may say, the current limit of affordability is 50 million, which assumes I can borrow at 3.5%, which requires me to ultimately provide £3 million worth of revenue headroom, which is temporarily financing the MTFP from the draws from Capital Equalisation Reserve. But it is not for me to dictate to Cabinet or Council what the overall figures are in due course, but it's just the planning assumptions worked through. So there may be cost pressures on the schemes you've referenced. There may be cost pressures on other schemes. They will wend their way through in due course to Cabinet. But at the moment, the figure that is in that capital programme for Castle Square is the figure that is afforded, and the same applies to any other scheme, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Leader?
Yeah, Chair, I was just going to make the point in a slightly different way in terms of, look, you'll be aware from the discussions we've had and from the presentations I've made previously that there is a long pipeline of developments, including phase 2 of Copper Bay. Our need to do some intervention potentially within the quadrant. The interventions we're making in the British Home Stores building to create the new library and archives hub, Castle Square itself, but a number of others. You know, as Mr. Smith has said, there is always a mix within that in terms of we often seek contributions from Welsh Government and others in terms of reducing the direct burden to us on those developments. And of course, until we go out to market and get a firm price from our partners in terms of developers or contractors, we won't know the final price. So again, it's not trying to be evasive, but it's a statement of fact that often we will be working hard in the background to try and draw in other sources of funding to try and reduce the burden directly on the council taxpayer. But of course, we don't know the full cost of the scheme until we go out to market.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the capital programme? If not, can I thank both you and the leader and Mr. Smith for attending this morning to go through the budget on our pre-decision scrutiny. We will now summarise the views, the feedback to Cabinet, and I again thank you both for attending.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee.
Thank you, Chair.
What I intend doing is to discuss with Bridge now what our feedback was. Is there anything in particular that any member thinks that should be in the feedback that would be important for us to go back and tell Cabinet about? No? I think one of the if we take into consideration what both education and social services have put forward, there's obviously a welcome from both those services about the uplift in their budget, but again, obviously not enough to cope with the pressures of inflation, etc. Fees and charges that in social services there was an issue with the fact that there is £6 million worth of savings and a 10% increase in the fees and charges, which they felt was a bit high, but understood reason why. Staffing, I've explained about the staffing in social services, very, very difficult. Child and family service placements, that one is got savings of half a million pound proposed in reducing placements of child and family services, and hope this is achievable in the current climate. I think that's a wish list as opposed to a definite savings anyway. Co-production.
Obviously, Chairman, it's something we'll keep an eye on.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. And co-production is strengthening organisation. Again, that's one that we're currently doing anyway. And what Councillor Paxton Wood-Williams stated earlier was about recommissioning services, where we went through commissioning services for about 5 years, maybe about 8 years ago. We done a load of commissioning, and some of them were successful, some weren't, did they? And that's one of the things. In education, welcome the uplift from 202 million to 215 million, but recognise this won't cover all the costs. Schools reserve reduced substantially and now approximately 11 million across all the schools in Swansea. The financial pressures that will be in schools, and then the pressure on reducing school meal budgets. That again is something I think that the Educational Scrutiny Board is looking at it again because of the consequences of the fact that there'd be more free school meals, or there will be school meals available for children in primary. If there's anything that you think that we've discussed today should be specifically put in my report to Cabinet on Thursday, if you could let me know. We will send around the synopsis of what we're going to discuss now. And if you could let me know, we'll send it around by just after lunch.
As soon as possible.
Yeah, as soon as possible. Put him under a bit of pressure anyway. So once that's out, if you can have a look at it and then let me know as soon as possible so we can write it up tomorrow. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, all. Thank you very much, Paxton, Bridget, Linda.
Bella.